friends, family. So the next minute, go ahead and drop in the chat 6 words, something enjoyable you did this summer. Traveled through northern Arizona. Binge watched. You only needed 2 words for that. I like it. Played games with my little guy. Read a lot of books. Reading, streaming, and playing with the kitty. Oh, that's fun. Sleeping, reading, and iced coffee drinking. Camping with family and laughing tons. Traveled and did PD. Spent some time with family and swimming. Planted a garden. Spent time with my family in a newly landscaped backyard and small pool. Lots of nature, which is great. Good way to fill your cup. Ohio and discovered New Mexico. It's a lot to see here. Zoom connections, quality time with family. ESY, it's a big one. All right, awesome. Well, go ahead and keep throwing them in. We're going to move on. Here's a quick preview of what we're going to be doing today. We're mostly just going to be going over some general tips, and then we've got an activity to kind of walk you through setting up some of those expectations and kind of doing some of the planning work, because we want you to be able to leave with a solid foundation of, here's some things I need to keep in mind those first week. And when we're talking first week, we're talking about your first week back as a teacher before students come back. And we're also talking about that first week when students come back. So 2 first weeks, but they're both equally important, and they both have some things that we need to keep in mind as we're starting to plan. All right, so this is teacher first week. So this is the week we're gonna come back. You probably are gonna have some site-based professional development. This is gonna be your time to spend in your classroom, getting yourself ready. If you're new to a school, it's probably gonna involve some things like building relationships, finding out where things are in the building. Couple things to keep in mind, planning. So that first week, this is really your opportunity to overplan. I always say overplan because that first week, especially if you've never done the first week, if this is your first year in the classroom, you're gonna be surprised how time flows. It's either gonna go really slow and you're not gonna have enough time, or you're gonna speed through things and you're gonna go, uh-oh, I don't have enough to fill this block of time. So I always say overplan, have things in your back pocket, have activities in your back pocket that you can pull out if you need to. And even if you have a lot of stuff planned, it's always good to have those activities for if there's a hiccup, right? If technology fails, if you have a drill and you can't do a full lesson, it's always a good idea to have a little extra activity or a few activities or a lesson in your back pocket just to pull out when you need to. Or maybe it's when you've got a stagnant period and you kind of need something to break up the time, get their attention back, something more engaging. So just keep that in mind as you're going into that first week. A lot of veteran teachers will have stuff already. So don't feel like you need to create this from scratch. There are a lot of things out there online. There are a lot of things I'm sure your colleagues have that I'm sure they'd be happy to share with you, just for you to keep in the back of your mind. Classroom setup. So thinking about what are the structures I want in the classroom? Am I keeping my desks in rows or am I doing them in groups? What do I want the classroom flow to look like, right? Where's my desk? And those are really important things to consider because that can even be how accessible you are to the students. So keeping in mind, what do you want your general layout to look like? How are your supplies stored? Where are you expecting students to get things and put things back? Just all of those little things. If you've got 45 kids in your room, you need to be mindful of where your supplies are so that you're not creating, a 5-minute lag because it takes 5 minutes for everybody to get in line and get the thing they need and then get back to their desk. So just be mindful about where you're putting things. Building relationships around the school, right? So I think a lot of times, and I'm sure you've heard this, your key people are going to be your custodians, your front desk woman, right? Your secretary or administrative assistant. Who are those people in the school that you maybe haven't had a chance to introduce yourself to, but are going to be really, really helpful in the long run? If you have somebody in the workroom, that's somebody you're going to want to get in contact with and start to get to know them. Your librarian is an essential resource, so just start to get to know those people, the people within your department, just making friends, introducing yourself. And those people are going to come up as support too. So as you're keeping that in mind, one of those other categories we have listed is support. So we're support for you. There's tons of support at the district level, and we're happy to kind of point you in the right direction if there's anything you're not sure where to go. We can do that for you, but there's also a lot of support at your school site too. So keep in mind, who are those people? Have those readily available to you and be familiar with them prior to jumping into that first week, so that no matter what gets thrown at you, you have kind of the antidote to fix it. Safety drills, get familiar with where you need to go, what are the procedures, and then resources. You know, we work with social studies teachers. We got new books 2 years ago, and I can tell you I still get emails probably weekly about, we can't find such and such. So before that first week with students, you're going to want to make sure you have all the resources, whether it's your curriculum, whether it's a tool or a technology piece you're using. Make sure you have all those things in place so that it doesn't create hiccups for you once students are back. All right, and then general tips: be flexible. It's probably not gonna go the way you anticipate. I think even after my 9th year in the classroom, I still, that first week, there were things that I had no idea were gonna happen that happened. So just go with the flow. It's kind of like one of those things you can plan for, but it probably won't ever go the way you think it's gonna go. So be flexible and be gentle with yourself, be graceful, because you know things are gonna happen, we're gonna mess up, and it's not the end of the world. Be mindful that our students have been out of the classroom for a long time. They came back in the spring, but 2020 was a really traumatic and emotionally difficult year for a lot of students and a lot of teachers too, right? So as we're making relationships with our teachers and our colleagues, be mindful of that. Everybody's kind of in this sensitive period. I know most of you probably listened to Scott this morning, and he made a good point that it's a weird time in education. And so we have to be a little forgiving and a little understanding with our students, especially those that are dealing with things like anxiety and depression. So as they're coming back to you, give them grace the same way you'd give yourself grace. And then slow down. I'm sure you've heard the term go slow to go fast. It is much more critical that you develop those relationships and those routines and structures in a solid way that first week and don't even touch content than it is to dive into your content. You're gonna get more accomplished with your content if you take that time that first week than if you rush into diving into the content and don't have those structures in place. So go slow, be mindful of how you're planning, be strategic in how you're planning, and then be forgiving when things don't go as fast or are going really slow, more than you expected. All right, and then communication. I think we've covered a little bit of this as far as staff and colleagues go. Avoid making assumptions about staff and colleagues. I think we've all heard of like the dreaded teacher's lounge, right? The more you can avoid situations that feel crunchy, like gossiping, or, you know, I remember coming into positions and people telling me something about someone else, and then it really tainted my experience with them. So try to turn on the earmuff, try to be intentional and integral with your word and with what kind of communication you're communicating or you're participating in with your colleagues, and then be able to willing to ask for help when you need it. With parents, be mindful. Does your school expect you to send out a parent letter? We've got a example in here you're welcome to use. But what does that communication with your parents look like that first week? How do you want to present yourself, your content to your parents? Make a positive first impact, right? So if we can avoid that scenario where you don't contact parents until something's gone wrong, the better. The better you're off you're going to be if you can do that. If you can start that relationship early and recognize that you're both in it for the same reasons, right? You're both there and you're both working with a student. In their case, it's their child. because they want them to learn and they want them to succeed. So you're both there for the same purposes. And if you can establish that healthy relationship early on, whether it's through a newsletter, maybe it's a call, maybe it's a visit to the house, any sort of relationship building you can do with parents when later on in the year you do need to contact them because you're having behavioral problems, because you're having problems with them doing work or showing up in class, they're much more likely to have a positive experience with you in solving that and coming up with solutions. And then with your students, be explicit, clear, and concise. I think Mark and Anna talked a lot about the importance of those structures and that consistency with students. And I'm just trying to reiterate that. We have to have that clear, concise expectations for our students. It doesn't mean we can't be vulnerable. It doesn't mean we can't build those relationships, but it means that we need to be really intentional about what we're setting up and the communication that we're having with students. Try your best to learn student names. I know one of the things I've heard new teachers really benefit from is doing their best to at least, pick a small group of students and say, in this one class period, I'm going to say all of these 30 students' names. The faster you can learn them, the better off you are with building those relationships. And then try and learn something new about them. I think one of our participants yesterday had a great suggestion of using your roll call or your attendance as a question. So rather than just saying their names and having them say present or here, saying what's your favorite color, and then when you call on their name, you get to know them a little bit. So each day you're walking away with a little bit more information about that student. And it could be something goofy like a color, waffles or pancakes. Those were hers. Yeah, Adriana, it was yours. I thought that was such a great example. So just little ways to build that community in your classroom and to get to know them. You can invite them to share their music. All of those little things add up over time. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Thanks, Taylor. So this part, we're going to look at some possible topics you can kind of schedule and plan your first week around. So we'll look at just briefly like the class routines and expectations, that relationship building and actually planning time for it, sharing behavior response with students and the school expectations. And yes, that first week you do a little bit more explicit attendance taking than you do the rest of the year. So blocking that time out. And then also that beginning of the content. So we're going to focus on these 6 topics coming up. And then we're going to use them in an activity later. So for the class routines, a lot of this we mentioned yesterday. Again, that not assuming that the students know what to do. Even high schoolers, even 8th grade, they may pick up on it quicker, but you still have to go through it with them. Getting that student input when helpful. So some of you mentioned in this morning's scenario session about that class mission statement. And we're going to do something with class expectations here in a little bit where we're going to contribute to class expectations, but your students can do this activity as well. Stating things in the positive, but also the one thing is not to overwhelm that first week with nothing but routines. Teach them as they arise. So, and one step at a time. So an example is homework. If you're not giving homework the first week, then you don't need to worry about the routine of how to turn in homework and everything just yet. Okay, that can wait until that time comes. But that first day, entering the class and leaving the class will definitely come up. So I found even with my 8th graders, when it was coming into class, I would give one step at a time. All I need you to do right now is go find a seat in class. That's it. Let's not worry about anything else. And it just kind of, instead of giving 3 or 4 and leading to a whole bunch of questions and chaos. So here are some specific first week routines you may need and some first week policies. Students are going to have their own Chromebooks now, so having that policy ready to go. Phones. A lot of schools were a little bit more lenient with students coming back in the spring last year about phone use, and now that may be switching back to kind of a regular school policy. So making sure you know what you want students to do with phones. And that's kind of why I have those in bold. Like leaving a classroom if you're a first year secondary teacher, have a plan, because if that bell rings and you don't have a plan, they're gone. They'll be gone and you won't be able to get them back. So having that ready to go and stopping a little bit early. If you have some others that you can think of for first week, I know Anna had a section of this where people gave ideas, but feel free to throw some others in the chat. We didn't want to list too many. So we've talked a lot about that relationship building, and Taylor mentioned trying to learn those names, student names, in the first 2 weeks or first week. Usually it took me about 2 weeks, but we mentioned this yesterday, being patient, okay? My jokes probably don't go over as well the first week because they don't really know me yet. They don't have that trust. And so I'll tell something I think is funny, and week 16, they would laugh. Week 1, kind of crickets at times. It takes time. So they'll pick up. They're still trying to figure you out at that point. And then we also talked about that warm demander. That first week, you definitely want to build that relationship, start that process with them, but they also need to see where those limits are, okay? Or else, like Taylor said, it's going to be hard to reel that back in later on. So one thing on this, we've provided some resources if you are looking for some relationship building activities. You can use these resources and definitely find some good ones in here. Or if you already have some and you're looking for a little bit more, we've provided these resources. And we even have an alternative assignment later where you can go through these and search and pick one for the first week. That behavior response first week. So do you know the school-wide plan? Do the students know it? Sometimes the school likes for teachers to break up parts of the agenda and talk to them about it. What is your classroom plan? And the reason we say to have this ready first week, sometimes you get the honeymoon period, sometimes you don't. I've had to start using my gradual response system on the first day before, where it just, one student just kept going and going. And so, we had to stop and talk about it and get that out and communicated how we're going to handle those situations. What are your non-negotiable behaviors versus what are the behaviors that you're a little bit more flexible on? And then realizing that behavior is a communication. Every situation is a teachable moment, whether it's day 1, day 180, every moment is a teachable moment. School expectations that first week. So Taylor mentioned those like Alice and fire drills. Not only do you know what to have to do, but setting aside time to build that into your schedule to teach the students. You don't want them to come on and say, okay, we're doing our Alice drill, and you're like, oh, I forgot. And now the students you're in the middle of it. So having that time where we said, okay, day 2, I know that the drill is day 3. So on day 2, I'm going to set aside some time and discuss the drill, what our class expectations are. Again, that teacher work week, finding out what's your school expect in terms of the agenda. If you're on a team, maybe the team breaks up parts of the agenda to go over them, but our school always had an expectation to cover certain aspects of the agenda. So how can you do that? And try and make it engaging, not just reading from the agenda. Can you spice it up and make it a productive activity for you in the class? Class counts. Are you going to have to? Scavenger hunts are great for those kind of agenda and finding those policies. So thank you for mentioning that. Class counts. Does your school expect you to take a class count aside? So build in that first 5 minutes for attendance that first week so you're remembering to do the class count every day. Those school policies, what are they? So dress code, does your school have one? Because a lot of schools kind of suspended dress code last fall or last spring when students came back, and now we have to get students used to that again. School policies on phones. Do they let the classroom teacher create their own or not? Lockers and backpacks were different last year for a lot of schools. And is that going to change or is that going to stay the same? We need to schedule time for these school expectations with students so that we're not sending them out and then they get someone else redirecting them out in the hallway because they were unaware, because that sometimes leads to bad situations. Attendance, there's all sorts of ways. We heard the great idea mentioned about using it to say, ask questions and use that as a relationship building. Where are you going to take attendance? I know by the end, I had students call out their names so I could hear them pronounce it one time so that I didn't go through that process of having to apologize. And so I'd go to their desk and be like, okay, tell me your name. And if you prefer to be called like by a certain nickname or how you want me to address you. And so I had them tell me that the very first day, and I just walked around and that seemed to work really well. Are you going to have seating charts first day, or are you going to give them choice? I put them in alphabetical order because it helped me learn names. And I told them this was like a 2-week stretch, and it helped me just have a roster and I could go through and see their names. And again, we mentioned, how do students prefer to be addressed? So here's an example. Use it, don't use it. But one thing I did was printed out a class roster, and then I put a number next to each of their names. And so after we'd gone through the initial process of them telling me their names, I put the class roster up on the board, and every desk had a number on it. And then they found the desk that had their number. And then they had them in alphabetical order kind of quickly. And then I could use that roster for the first 2 weeks of when they were working on something, I could be practicing their names to myself and making sure I'm learning the names. So that just helped me. That was one way, but there's so many creative ways to do that the first week. And finally, content. Stay light on the content because the relationship building, the routines are more important that first week. Go slow to go fast. Like Taylor said, you may not get to as much content the first week, maybe the first 2 weeks, but you can make up that time if you get that foundation laid with the class. Thinking about, can you start to experiment and see how your class, what teaching style works well for them through other activities? And start to try and get those students engaged with the content. Can you think of a creative way to introduce the content that makes it seem like, oh, this is going to be something I'm looking forward to? So some specific things you might do first week, a syllabus. So what is the course going to look like and possible goals? Laying that foundation, can we show them some real life applications of this content or professions that are connected to it? What have student experiences been in the past with this content? I know math, I let them have that time to express. Some of them love math or they hate math, and letting them verbalize that and letting us kind of get that out of, okay, we've had these past experiences, but let's set a goal also for this year and see if we can overcome some of that. But giving them that opportunity, giving them some kind of challenge that really engages and gets them going, that maybe it's not a standard, but it's connected to your content and it's a challenge problem they can work on. Does your department have a pretest they give? Ask your colleagues. We did have a pretest, and I used that pretest, did it on Fridays, and I used it as my practice time to learn their names because they were quietly working on something, and I would just drill myself on their names as they were working on that. So you can kind of combine two goals. Do you have a specific note-taking protocol you'd like to teach them? So all these, you may not get fully into the standards, but these are maybe some foundational content things you could do the first week. So what we're going to do now is give you some time to do some actual task that could be beneficial for the first week. And so we have this main activity page that Heather just dropped into the chat. You will need to open that up, and it should force you to make a copy so everybody has their own version. Okay, looks like that's a go. And then later on, the enrichment, we do have some other activities that we just don't have time for today, and we'll give you some choice a little bit later on. But once you open that activity page, we're going to look at the first activity together, and then we're going to put you in some breakout rooms to discuss. So some schools have different frameworks of how they set like school expectations. Like if you have one your school uses, feel free to drop it in the chat. One that my first school had was the respectful, be responsible, be ready. And so we use that as a general framework. And we're going to use that to brainstorm ideas and then share ideas with our colleagues. So on the next slide, and this is an activity students can do in your class if you want to. So you should see that part on your document. And we're going to give you about 3 minutes. Can you think of any specific behaviors or ideas that in class that fall under the categories of respectful, responsible, ready? So one that I always taught my students the first day was, I'll make mistakes, and if you disagree with me, I have no problem with you disagreeing with me on something. Just ask to speak to me in private. Okay, we don't want it to be like you're trying to call me out in front of everybody. Let's have a private conversation. That was an expectation that made a world of difference establishing day one. So we'll give you about 3 minutes right now. Come up with as many specific ideas that fall under respectful, responsible, and ready. And then we'll go on to the next step. And what we're going to do in a couple of minutes is we'll put you in breakout rooms and you can collaborate together with a small group and share ideas you've had. So Heather, I'd say 4 to 5 people in each one, just in case 1 or 2 have to leave. So one reason we wanted to do this where you kind of work on this and come up with your own ideas, if you do have students do this activity in class, at least you know some of the expectations you want that you would like to see, and you can guide students. So they still have the freedom to make these decisions, but we can kind of manipulate them a little bit to some of the ways that some of the expectations we want to see. All right, so Heather, if you can go to the next slide. So, oh, never mind. You can stay back. That up. Okay, so what we're going to do is put you into breakout rooms here in just a moment. You might have to give a quick introduction of yourselves like we did in the earlier session, because you might be with new people you haven't met before. And then just talk about some ideas of what you put on respectful, responsible, and being ready, and see how you could use this or maybe some other templates in your class. So let the conversation go where you need to, but you can add ideas to your own list if you hear some good ones from some other people. Are there any questions before we go to breakouts? Okay, so about 10 minutes. We'll go to this. Should be enough time for this piece, and then we'll bring you back. So have a good conversation with your colleagues.
Philip, are you having issues getting into the breakout room? Stephanie and Amy?
So I think what I was thinking of, I don't think we really need to do a share out